The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 18th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme.
To the people of Middletown, Ohio, and all the forgotten communities in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and every corner of our nation, I promise you this: I will be a vice president who never forgets where he came from.
Elegy from a hillbilly. Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, Senator JD Vance, speaks at the Republican National Convention. How nervous should America's overseas allies be? Also ahead.
Because I believe that the UK and the EU, working together as sovereign partners, are a powerful force for good across our continent.
The UK's new Prime Minister hosts leaders of the European political community at Blenheim Palace. Later in the show, we'll wrap up headlines from the worlds of business and railways. And no, we haven't cancelled it yet. People seem to enjoy it for some reason. Just grit your teeth and get through it. Oh, I've read that out loud again, haven't I?
Salon, Andrew. Today on the Global Countdown, the delights of Uzbek pop.
All that coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. Last night at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, centre stage was ceded to Donald Trump's recently anointed vice presidential running mate, Senator JD Vance of Ohio. Vance's speech will have been listened to carefully by countries which consider themselves, for the moment at least, America's allies. Even by the standards of the Yahoo wing of the Republican Party, Vance has been notably unkeen on continuing assistance to Ukraine, and indeed has said that he doesn't care what happens to Ukraine. That said, he has also said that only an idiot would ever vote for Donald Trump, so he is clearly capable of changing his mind. Joining us now from the convention in Milwaukee is the correspondent Simon Marks. Simon, before we get into the potential foreign policy implications of Trump's choice of running mate, what were your general impressions of Vance's speech?
Well, look, I think he had a difficult task last night, Andrew, because the speech, a single speech, had to accomplish so much. He had essentially to introduce himself to convention delegates. Remember, he's only been a national figure here for about 18 months since he was elected to the Senate from Ohio. So some delegates are not particularly familiar with him, certainly not with the details of his resume, which is why he went through his background, hard scrabble as it was, in the mountains of Appalachia. But he also had to reach into American living rooms and present a vision of what the Trump administration in a second term is going to look like. He made multiple references to key battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and a couple of others, absolutely making it clear that he's putting a target on those states. It's his job, essentially, to bring them into Donald Trump's column. He told his personal story with, I think, considerable effect and at times some emotion, but he also rattled some sabers on behalf of Donald Trump in terms of the Trump administration and the Make America Great Again movement's ambitions to move to a hard right series of positions, both in terms of domestic and foreign policy. It seemed to go down reasonably well with delegates. I can't say that there was rapturous applause that were making the rafters of the building shake, but that will please Donald Trump because he never likes sharing the limelight fight with anyone.
Well, indeed not. Did Senator Vance get into any detail on foreign policy? From what is known of him so far, he does come across as something of an isolationist.
Yes, and an isolationist with a couple of asterisks, I think, is the way to look at things. I mean, the presentation of his speech was entirely focused on the need for the United States to put America first. He used that phrase repeatedly, and he slammed Joe Biden, who he said had been essentially an active political leader for most of JD Vance's life, for leading America into a foreign policy crisis. Now, it's absolutely apparent that China is going to be an area of considerable focus for a new Trump administration. They want to move away from focusing on Europe's defense and security. JD Vance has previously described a wake-up call that he wants to deliver to European leaders, that they need to take more responsibility for their own defense so that the United States can pivot to Asia and focus on China's expansionist ambitions. He said last night, we're going to stop the Chinese Communist Party from building their middle class on the backs of American citizens, which is a fresh indication that he's a huge supporter of tariffs to keep Chinese goods out of the country, and he's a big supporter of a hardline crackdown to confront China wherever and whenever it threatens America's democratic partners and allies in the Asia-Pacific region. However, he also said there will be no more free rides for nations that betray the generosity of the American taxpayer. And that opens an absolutely massive series of questions, fueled as they have been by comments that former President Trump made in an interview with Bloomberg, in which he said that he believed that Taiwan should be paying the American costs of its own defense and assistance. And he said that, as far as he could see, the US was simply acting like an insurance company and therefore should be expecting the recipients of that kind of defence aid to cover the costs of them. It's very similar to the argument that Donald Trump used during his first term about NATO. So big questions about precisely what this pivot to Asia and confronting China truly means in practical terms.
But did Senator Vance, or has anybody in this putative incoming administration, articulated any coherent vision, I guess, for what role they do see the United States playing on the world stage?
Well, there were some broad brush comments made earlier in the evening by Ambassador Rick Grinnell, who used to be the US ambassador to Germany in the Trump first administration, who sort of put a bit of flesh on the bones of an America first foreign policy, insisting that Donald Trump had been such a towering figure that men like Vladimir Putin and the Iranians had absolutely understood that if they took some of the actions that they've taken during the Biden administration, Donald Trump would basically not tolerate it, and life for them would become extremely grim. Now, again, very little detail of that. And the big asterisk in all of this, of course, is the Middle East, because while JD Vance and Donald Trump say they want to end assistance to President Volodymyr Zelensky's forces in Kiev, they actively believe in maintaining and expanding the US relationship with Israel, arguing that relationship and Israel's government more broadly is essential to protecting American interests in the Middle East. Now, do they think that Israel should be covering the costs of its own defense? Is Israel expected to be treated by the United States like the client of an insurance company? That is very unclear from everything that we've heard here.
And Simon, just finally, we should look at developments in the opposing camp. President Joe Biden isolating for at least the next little while after being confirmed with COVID-19. Has that re-amplified suggestions that he should think about standing aside?
Yes, I mean, there's been growing mood music while we've been here in Milwaukee from Washington, D.C. every single day that has indicated that the uprising against Joe Biden from within his own party is not over at all and now is accelerating rapidly. And I think that COVID diagnosis for many Democrats in Congress is going to be absolutely the last straw. We now know that the Senate Majority Leader Charles Schumer and the House Democrat leader Hakeem Jeffries personally urged Joe Biden last weekend to drop out of the race. We know that he's been advised by one of his mega donors, Jeffrey Katzenberg, that all the money for his campaign from the West Coast and other locations is drying up. And we presume that Joe Biden is now spending a weekend contemplating his future after at least one report here by CNN, mirrored in fact now by the New York Times, that the president is more receptive than he has been to the idea of leaving the ticket. Now that's not a difficult bar to reach, because he's been absolutely non-receptive to the messages that have been privately delivered to him by people like the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi. You know, she doesn't mess around, so she's absolutely driving this leak of information to reporters, having warned the Biden team that if they didn't listen to her privately, there was a very strong chance that the restive group of Democrats on Capitol Hill were going to go public. So I think events are moving very quickly. Let's see what happens next week. But there is an air of inevitability beginning to grow about Joe Biden's departure from the race.
Simon Marks in Milwaukee, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Here is Laura Kramer with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Joe Biden is ill with COVID-19 as the president insisted that only ill health would force him out of the White House race against Donald Trump. It adds to the mounting pressure on the president to stand down from his campaign following calls by senior Democrats, including Chuck Schumer. Haiti's prime minister has ordered gangs to surrender their weapons during a televised speech. He acknowledged how dangerous life in Haiti's capital and beyond has become and pledged to crack down on the rampant violence. Gangs are currently in control of 80% of Port-au-Prince. And South Korea's Supreme Court has ruled that same-sex couples are entitled to spousal state benefits. The landmark decision has been hailed as a major victory for the LGBTQ+ community in the country. While the country does not recognize same-sex marriages, gay relationships are not criminalized. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Laura. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and here in the UK, a headline of yesterday's King's Speech, the ritual in which the monarch puts on a jewel-encrusted hat and reads out the stuff the government claims it is going to do, was the recently elected Labour Party's promise to press ahead with the renationalisation of the UK's railways under the name Great British Railways. Well, joining me now to discuss its chances of living up to that name, along with other rail-related developments, is Christian Woolmer, a writer and broadcaster specialising in transport. First of all, to Great British Railways, do we know how this reacquisition of the rail network by the state is going to work?
Yes, we do. And I love your description of the crazy process by which we issue legislation. I mean, really, it's time we grew up and didn't have the King reading out a speech written to him by the Prime Minister. But hey, yes, we do know how this is going to work. Essentially, the railways were broken up in the 90s so that there was an infrastructure company initially called Railtrack and now called Network Rail, initially privatized but now state-owned. And then there was the operators who are all privatized, companies like Stagecoach and Virgin and so on. And what the present planned legislation is going to do is to bring those back in-house. So in other words, when the contracts with those private companies run out, the government will take back the running of the operations and hand it to this new organization, which apparently is going to be called Great British Railways, kind of harking back to the British Rail that was actually privatized back in the mid-90s.
I mean, this has become a sort of fond sentiment among a lot of the British public, I think, animated by a certain amount of possibly misguided nostalgia, but certainly frustration with the current state of Britain's railways. Are there coherent, concrete reasons to believe that this will be any better, I guess, other than the fact that it probably couldn't get much worse?
Yes, I mean, there's two good reasons. I mean, first of all, I wrote a book called British Rail, A New History. And, it was a journey of discovery for me. And for some 35 years of British Rail's 50-year existence, it was pretty chaotic and didn't work very well. But in the last 10 years of its existence, it actually created a series of brands like Intercity and Network Southeast. It actually ran a railway very efficiently, had new projects such as electrification that were conducted efficiently and so on. So there's a good reason to kind of hark back to that. And secondly, what this legislation does is to really re-establish the proper way of running railways, which is that you do not want a separate company to be running the infrastructure and a different company to be running the operations and all sorts of other companies involved. Railways are inherently an integrated business. I mean, you can't run trains without the track, and you can't have the track doing anything unless there's trains running on it. So it was a daft idea to kind of split it up. And the best railways in the world, like Japan and Switzerland, have this kind of integrated structure. And indeed, probably 95% of the railways in history have run with that structure. So this will recreate it. And that is a hope for optimism.
Well, looking a bit further afield, the European Union's Tent T regulation takes effect today. Basically, what is that and what difference is that going to make to Europe's railways?
Well, Europe's railways have been beset with a whole lot of problems about integrating the different national systems. There's both technical barriers, there's union barriers, and so on. So this idea is to create a series of, I think 9 now, kind of corridors, routes whereby the rail infrastructure will be improved, the customs and other issues will be resolved, technical issues will be resolved. Now, all at the moment, this is just the regulations to create those routes. But freight has lost out in Europe. Despite the kind of good distances, freight works well on rail over big distances. But despite those distances, it's lost out because of all the complexity of running trains through all these different countries. So this is an attempt to solve that, resolve both the technical issues and the bureaucratic issues. And hopefully it will result in more trains carrying more freight and therefore fewer lorries on the roads.
And Christian, just finally, one consequence of the recently concluded European Football Championships is that nobody is making jokes about German trains running on time anymore.
No, they're making jokes about them not running on time. And indeed, the England team at one point had to kind of jump on a plane because its train was cancelled. And it highlighted a problem that I'm going to write about in the Monocle magazine, actually. The fact that German railways have been greatly neglected in recent years. Now, we think of, we always think, particularly in Britain, we think, oh, the Germans so much better. You're so efficient, those Germans. How do they do it? Well, in fact, for the last 10, 15 years, they've greatly neglected the infrastructure of the railways. In other words, the track and the signalling and all the kind of backroom stuff. And they've underinvested in that. They were going to try and privatize it, and that didn't work, as basically it hasn't worked in most countries. So they're now kind of having to recoup and invest strongly to improve the situation. But that involves closing the line, a major line between Frankfurt and Mannheim from now until Christmas, and running bus replacement service, which are dreaded kind of message that no rail passenger ever wants to get. Your train is now a bus. But so they're on the path to recovery, but it was a big embarrassment during the Euros.
Christian Mormar, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. 2 weeks since the UK's general election, and Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has already attended a NATO summit in Washington, D.C., a European Championship final in Berlin, and now finds himself at another international conclave, if on home turf, the 4th summit of the fledgling European political community, being convened at the unsubtly symbolic venue of Blenheim Palace, birthplace of Winston Churchill. Well, joining us from there There is Carol Walker, political commentator and Times Radio presenter, and also the political correspondent, Matthew Holhouse. Carol, first of all, before we get into this particular summit, the EPC itself, it has now existed for about 2 years. Do we entirely understand what it's for?
Well, you're right that it's existed for 2 years. It was really the brainchild of President Macron of France, who wanted to create this wider community to discuss shared challenges, things like security, migration, and so on. And in part, it was Macron's more grandiose schemes of what countries can do together, which he created at a time when he was in a slightly stronger position at home. And the meeting at Blenheim Palace had been arranged by Rishi Sunak when he was the British Prime Minister. But of course, it comes at a very opportune time for the new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. He's already met some of the key EU leaders in the margins of the big NATO summit last week. But he's been talking about this as an opportunity to reset relations with the EU. And indeed, in the last hour, he's actually addressed the summit, said the UK and the EU working together is a powerful cause for good. And he talked about the need for them to stand together. Two big items that I think they want to discuss. First of all, Ukraine. President Zelensky has also already addressed the opening session, talking about the need for Europe to stand together against Russia. And Keir Starmer backing that, saying, our security is on the line. And the other big issue, Sir Keir Starmer really hoping to try to get some kind of new arrangement underway, or at least under discussion, on how to deal with illegal migration.
Matthew, to bring you in, is it possible to say how, I guess, relieved or otherwise the European leaders gathering at Blenheim Palace are by the change in UK government, perhaps by the idea that they might be able to rely a bit more on the UK government as opposed to enduring the last decade or so of incomprehensible psychodrama?
Yeah, I mean, if we're to sort of put the past decade in context, clearly the Brexit years were difficult, and they became more difficult as the years went by. And we only have to go back to as recently as 2021, when we're looking at, potentially a full collapse in relations, even, a trade war potentially. That's when, the negotiations over revising the Northern Ireland Protocol were underway. In full fairness to them, Rishi Sunak managed to stabilise the relationship a huge amount. He got the Windsor framework underway. He sort of normalised relations on a number of fronts. He actually was able to build a little bit on Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement. That said, obviously, the fact that Keir Starmer wants to, as he puts it, reset the relationship and you have an overtly pro-European policy will be welcomed by a lot of leaders. The question is, what actually can you go beyond that into something sort of substantive and additive to the existing relationship in terms of trade relations or security relations? I mean, that's the really, really difficult bit, and we still don't have a really sort of clear timetable as to how that agenda might unfold, or even what the sort of the bandwidth is for European leaders on that.
And staying with you, Matthew, and on a somewhat related theme, has there been any indication of nervousness among European leaders about developments on the other side of the Atlantic?
Well, it's not been a sort of over here, but you only have to look around. I mean, in truth, the consequences of Donald Trump for Europe have been on the horizon now for 8 years. It was, his election was a huge shock back in 2016. It drove a lot of the thinking in the European Union about much greater strategic autonomy, as it's known, much greater capacity of Europe to defend itself. And so, that debate is evidently renewing.
And Carol, to come back to you, what are we expecting by way of conclusion from this meeting? Is it in the communique issuing business? Will there be some sort of definitive statement?
Well, I'm sure that they will want to come out with some sort of statement expressing unity, support for Ukraine and so on, and a willingness to work together on shared challenges, including migration. Whether that actually goes as far as any specific deals, I think is very unlikely. Keir Starmer clearly wants to get a new arrangement to send back some of the migrants that are coming across the channel in small boats. He's actually got a one-to-one dinner with President Macron later this evening after all the other leaders have left. But of course, EU leaders are struggling with the problems of illegal migration themselves. And if they're going to make greater efforts on that, they'll want something in return. That, we're told, could mean, for example, a requirement for Britain to take some migrants that come into the wider EU, perhaps the children or relatives of people who are already here in the UK. And there are political risks in that for Keir Starmer. I mean, he's got a whacking great majority. And in terms of his parliamentary strength, he can certainly withstand it. But there's absolutely no doubt that if he enters into some deal which allows him to take in some EU migrants whilst also getting help in taking back some of those that have come across the channel to the UK, his political opponents in the Tory party and some of the right-wing press are just waiting to accuse him of betraying Brexit. So it will be interesting to see whether he feels that it's worthwhile getting those sorts of practical arrangements, having scrapped the very controversial plan to send some migrants to Rwanda as one of the first things he did when he came to power. Whether he'll go beyond that to try to get a new deal that he thinks will work if he feels he can withstand the political flack that would probably accompany that.
Carol Walker and Matthew Holhouse, thank you both for joining us. This is The Briefing. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller, and that music can only mean one thing, which is, of course, that you should by now have thrown your radio into a pond and taken shelter in the basement. It is time for our weekly Global Countdown with Monocle's senior correspondent, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, and God help us all, where are you taking us this week?
I'm very excited. As usual, I'm excited.
You're always very excited, Fernando. It's like on air, off air, Global Countdown, not Global Countdown. It doesn't get tiring.
But listen, we're going to Uzbekistan, and what a fantastic music scene they have. I mean, I would recommend people to go to Tashkent and go to a discotheque. I mean, it's incredible.
A discotheque in Tashkent?
Yeah. That could be the name of my favorite album or something.
Have you ever been to a discotheque in Tashkent?
Unfortunately not, but I'm planning to. After listening...
You are literally planning to.
Listen, you will understand what I'm saying here, because number 5, I mean... It's funny because I describe this song as a story about broken love with a lovely disco beat in the background. It is by...
That's an audacious melding of soundtrack and theme.
It's Teodora Niozova with Yugur, which means run.
Is she dancing through the tears, Fernando?
She's not quite dancing. She's like on the stairs and kind of being all dramatic.
She's waving wistfully back and forth.
She's very...
Is she threatening to hurl herself down them, do you think?
Not quite. No. Thank God for that. But
well, indeed.
She's very glamorous. I mean, she's wearing kind of a headscarf, and her skin is fabulous. I think people in Uzbekistan, they spend a lot of money with skincare. They must. Is
that the money they save on hair care?
Probably.
At number 4.
And number 4, this is a more traditional Uzbek ballad. It's by Botir Kodirov, and the song's called Sevgisi Yolag Onen, which means love is a lie. Also great skin.
Well, yeah, I know, but which clearly wasn't enough. I mean, the poor fellow, he is bereft.
He's bereft.
The too long didn't listen there is she's done him wrong. She's run off with the Pilates instructor.
At least he's rich because he's singing close to his Mercedes on the riverbank. I was trying to...
Do we know it's his Mercedes? I mean, anyone can stand next to a Mercedes.
That's true.
It might be second-hand.
It's a beautiful riverbank. I thought it was in Tashkent, but then I was Googling images of Tashkent. I don't think it was in Tashkent. Maybe because he does go to Dubai quite a lot.
I don't know if there's much of a river in Dubai either, to be honest.
That's a very good one, actually. So I have no idea. So
it could be a green screen thing. The whole thing might be a total hoax.
But there's some controversy about this singer because apparently
really?
He's claiming to be the son of an Uzbek artist called Sherali Joreyev who died last September. So now there's a whole controversy in Uzbek press that apparently, I mean, they might have to look at the body. It's all very morbid.
So hang on, what? I do not understand why any of this would necessitate exhuming the corpse of a recently deceased Uzbek pop singer.
It's all very confusing, but then members of the family of Sherali are saying, no, he's not the son.
Is he claiming to be the son, or is this claim being made on his behalf by others? I mean, and to be
he's claiming himself.
To be very clear, I could not care less.
From what I've read at the Uzbek press, from very confident sources, he's claiming himself.
The global countdown has gone to a dark place this week,
yes,
Fernando.
I'm sorry.
And we've still got 3 songs to go.
Number 3, I think, is a bit more chilled.
Well, that would not be difficult.
It's a very complicated name, this one. His name is Jaloluddin Ahmadliyev.
Well done.
Kuidurji. Shall we have a listen?
Just to be clear, nobody, as a consequence of that song, is going to have to dig up a corpse.
No, thank God.
That's something.
Actually, on a more positive note, one thing that I found out about Jaloluddin is how much he charges for a wedding. Apparently, in the Uzbek press,
is this to perform at one, or to be the participant?
To perform at one.
Okay, this is not some sort of visa racket he's running.
He's one of the most expensive ones.
Okay,
I mean, still mildly affordable, at least for London standards. It's with $3,000, you could invite Jaloluddin for your wedding. It's expensive. He's one of the most expensive ones.
And for $6,000, he won't come?
Exactly. I mean, I'm not sure if I would hire him. I think Diodora number 5 is better. She was a bit cheaper, actually, on that list. So
is this something all Uzbek pop singers do? Like, next to their entry on the chart, is there the current rate for them to perform at a wedding?
I'm not joking, but I think so, because there's been a lot of articles on Uzbek press how much you can hire an artist for. I love how open they are about this. I wish we could have that as well. How much you can charge for Britney, Beyonce, or whatever, you know?
I mean, if he's getting, what, $3,000 a shot? I mean, I'm in the wrong racket. I'm going to move to Uzbekistan and become a pop singer.
Yeah, just do 2 weddings a week and that's fine.
Exactly. At number 2.
Number 2, that's an amazing one. This song is a Technicolor fantasy. She's a 49-year-old, very glamorous. It's the great Ozoda with Kokchilugi, which means blue skies, I believe. Let's have a listen.
From which I glean that those annoying 1980s electronic drums have just reached Uzbekistan. Do we know what she charges to do a wedding?
No, that was you know what? I think Ozoda, she's a legend. So I think it's more than $3,000. Please, Ozoda, have some respect.
And that is a more upbeat tune. You can kind of see that as a floor filler shortly before the DJ resorts to Hi-Ho Silver Lining.
But she's affecting the car companies in
She's
Uzbek.
affecting the car companies.
You know why? Because there's a blue car in the video. So there's a lot of blue in the video. She's wearing
a Mercedes.
It's not a Mercedes.
Oh, okay.
It's actually one of those old vintage cars. I don't know their names.
Righto.
She's wearing like a turquoise pantsuit. It's all about blue. So basically the number of blue cars sold in Uzbekistan, they rose this year because of this song. So, it's the power of Ozoda. I'm telling you.
Fernando, I think I'm beginning to have certain doubts about the fact-checking regimes at certain Uzbek news journals. But okay, why not? Number one, in Uzbekistan. And obviously, given that we have already had somebody revolutionising Uzbekistan's automobile industry, someone else having to dig up a corpse for reasons I don't really understand. There's a high bar to clear here. To get to number one in Uzbekistan this week, you have to have done something remarkable.
He's remarkable. And to be honest, let's be serious. He had a very tough childhood. He comes from a very poor background, but now he's the biggest star in Uzbekistan. And you know what?
Well, that'll show them.
Looking at the numbers, this song, it had 132 million views on YouTube.
Okay.
And he's very funny. He looks very camp. He wears a huge moustache, and he likes a blue kind of suit as well.
This is a thing, clearly.
It's a thing. Let's have a listen to Zandan Zobirov with Malohat, which means comfort.
That is dreadful, Fernando. It does have electronic, annoying drums in it. I rather suspect that an earlier demo of that tune may have involved an accordion.
I don't know about that. All I know, there's no blue cars. Apparently, there's a green car in the video. And just to describe the video, it looks very... Although it's quite camp and extravagant, it looks quite expensive. It starts with a lot of women wearing pink dresses at the top of a mountain, doing a very special choreography.
How did they get up there? What shoes are they wearing?
To be fair, it's not the Everest. It was not such a big, tall mountain.
More of a hill than a mountain.
Yeah, I think I was exaggerating here, but it looks beautiful. Maybe it's the sound of music a la Uzbekistan,
Well, on that bewildering thought, Fernando Augusto Pacheco, thank you as always for the Global Countdown. That is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAvaney. Our researchers were Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Germani, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back at the same time tomorrow, midday London. I'm Andrew Mullett. Thank you for listening.